this episode, we're going to spend time on the moment where cloud security becomes real for most organizations, which is when something inside the environment needs to be reachable from outside it. That could be a customer-facing website, a partner integration, a remote employee portal, or an endpoint that accepts requests from other systems. These are external entry points, and they are different from internal systems because they sit in the open, receiving attention from legitimate users and from people who are just trying to see what doors you left unlocked. Identity and Access Management, IAM, is the discipline that decides who is allowed through those doors and what they are allowed to do once they arrive. When IAM is applied well at the boundary, access stays intentional and predictable rather than accidental and sprawling. When it is applied casually, the boundary becomes a guessing game where convenience quietly outruns control. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful way to think about external entry points is that they combine two things that rarely mix safely without careful design, which are broad visibility and meaningful privilege. Visibility means anyone on the internet can attempt a connection, whether they are a paying customer, a curious scanner, or an attacker testing credentials at scale. Privilege means that if the connection succeeds, the request is no longer just a knock on the door, because it may translate into data access, business actions, or an ability to trigger workflows inside your environment. Beginners often assume that risk only begins after someone gets deep into a network, but at the boundary, risk begins the moment identity is accepted. That is why IAM best practices belong right at the edge, not tucked away as an internal administrative concern. If the edge is handled intentionally, everything behind it becomes easier to defend, monitor, and reason about. Strong authentication is the first pillar of intentional access, because you cannot control what you cannot confidently identify. Password-only authentication is fragile in the modern world because passwords are reused, guessed, stolen from breaches, and collected through convincing social tricks. Multi-factor authentication, MFA, strengthens the proof by requiring an additional factor beyond a password, which makes simple credential theft far less useful. External entry points are especially exposed to automated attacks like credential stuffing, where attackers try large sets of known username and password pairs to see what works. With MFA in place, a correct password alone stops being a reliable key. The goal is not to make login miserable, but to make it meaningfully harder for the most common and scalable attacks to succeed. Once you accept that attackers can persuade people as effectively as they can exploit software, phishing resistance becomes the next essential idea at the boundary. A beginner might assume that any MFA automatically defeats phishing, but many phishing attacks are designed to capture both the password and the second factor in real time. This is why some authentication methods are considered more phishing-resistant than others, because they bind the proof to the legitimate destination in a way that is difficult to relay. If the proof of identity only works for the real service and not for a lookalike site, the attacker cannot simply proxy the login and walk in behind the victim. That difference matters most at external entry points, where the attacker can repeatedly try new lures until someone takes the bait. When you prefer phishing-resistant flows for high-impact access, you are choosing an identity method that is harder to trick, not merely harder to guess. After identity is proven, the next decision is what that identity is allowed to do. And this is where many external systems fail in surprisingly simple ways. Authorization is the part that translates identity into capability, meaning which actions are permitted and which resources are reachable. If authorization is too broad, a single compromised login becomes more than an account problem because it becomes a data problem and a control problem. Least privilege means the identity receives only the permissions needed for its purpose, and that purpose should be narrow and understandable in plain language. External entry points often serve multiple populations, like customers, partners, and support teams, and each population should land in a role that matches what they truly need. Intentional access is not just knowing who arrived, but ensuring they can only touch what they were meant to touch. The challenge for beginners is that permissions in cloud environments can feel abstract, so it is easy to default to broad roles simply because the system works afterward. A more mature approach is to treat permissions like a map of possible outcomes, where every extra permission expands the number of harmful things that can happen if something goes wrong. If a customer account only needs to view and update its own profile, it should not have permissions that accidentally allow access to other customer records. If a partner integration only needs to submit a specific type of request, it should not have wide read access that exposes internal data. Overbroad authorization is also harder to monitor because everything looks allowed, so abnormal behavior blends into normal behavior. Tight authorization makes monitoring more meaningful because the permitted behaviors are fewer and better defined. When permission boundaries are clear, intent becomes visible in how the system behaves. Conditional access adds a layer of intelligence to authentication and authorization by letting the system consider context rather than treating every login attempt as equal. Context can include where the request is coming from, whether the device looks managed and healthy, and whether the behavior matches expected patterns. The important beginner takeaway is that correct credentials do not always deserve the same trust, because risk changes with circumstances. A login from a familiar device in a familiar region is not the same as a login from an unfamiliar device in an unusual location, especially when it happens at an odd time or follows many failed attempts. Conditional decisions can require stronger verification, limit what features are available, or block access entirely when risk rises. This helps keep external access usable for legitimate users, while making it increasingly difficult for attackers who depend on abnormal conditions to succeed. Another part of keeping access intentional is controlling the lifetime and scope of the trust you hand out after authentication succeeds. External entry points often rely on session tokens, and those tokens are valuable because they represent ongoing access without repeatedly asking for credentials. If tokens live too long or carry overly broad scopes, they become attractive targets that can be stolen and replayed. Application Programming Interface (API) interactions commonly use tokens, and a token that can be used for many actions across many resources is effectively a portable master key. Short lifetimes reduce how long a stolen token remains useful, and narrow scopes reduce what a stolen token can do. This is not about constantly interrupting users, but about ensuring trust stays fresh and bounded. When tokens are time-limited and purpose-limited, external access remains aligned with what was intended at the moment it was granted. Separating human access from machine access is another best practice that keeps external entry points from becoming confusing and dangerous over time. Humans typically log in interactively and can handle step-up verification, while machines need predictable non-interactive access for specific workflows. Beginners sometimes assume that a single shared credential for an integration is fine as long as it works, but shared credentials destroy accountability and make revocation painful. A machine identity should be unique to a specific integration, tightly scoped, and designed to rotate or expire without breaking everything unexpectedly. Human identities should be governed with policies appropriate for people, including stronger checks for sensitive actions and careful handling of recovery. When you mix these models, you end up with people using machine credentials or machines relying on human accounts, and both patterns increase risk. Clear separation makes policy design clearer and investigation easier when something looks wrong. External entry points that involve API access deserve special care because they are often designed for automation and therefore operate at high speed and high volume. A small mistake in how an API is secured can turn into a large impact, because automated calls can retrieve or modify a lot of data quickly. Strong authentication for API calls matters, but so does validating that each request is within the scope intended for that token. If an integration is only meant to read one dataset, it should not be able to enumerate everything else simply because it has a valid token. Rate limiting and anomaly detection help here, not as replacements for identity controls, but as guardrails that notice when a valid identity is being used in an unexpected way. External API access should feel like a carefully defined contract, not an open-ended capability. When you enforce that contract consistently, you prevent a stolen key from becoming a broad breach. Federation can make external access more manageable, but it also introduces a trust relationship that must be validated continuously rather than assumed forever. Federation often means your service accepts identity assertions from an external identity provider, IDP, allowing users to log in with credentials managed elsewhere. This can improve user experience and centralize control, but it also means your boundary now depends on the upstream security posture of the IDP. Intentional access in a federated model requires careful validation of what you accept, including ensuring tokens are signed correctly, intended for your service, and limited in time. It also requires making deliberate choices about which external identities are allowed to federate into which resources. If federation is treated like a blanket bridge instead of a controlled gate, it can silently broaden access far beyond what anyone meant. When federation is scoped and validated, it becomes an orderly way to extend identity without surrendering control. Monitoring is what turns IAM from a static policy into a living system that can detect misuse at the boundary. External entry points naturally attract noise, and that noise is useful because it reveals what the world is trying to do to you. Failed logins, repeated attempts across many accounts, unusual geographic patterns, and sudden spikes in requests can indicate active attack activity even when the attacker is not yet successful. Successful logins also need attention, because a successful login at an unusual time or from an unusual device can be a signal of compromise. Monitoring should focus on identity events and on the actions taken afterward, because intent is revealed by behavior over time. When monitoring is designed around what normal looks like, it becomes easier to spot what abnormal looks like, which is exactly what you need at the boundary. Fast revocation is the practical safety lever that prevents a suspicious or no longer needed access path from lingering as a permanent risk. External access changes constantly because people change roles, partners change contracts, devices are lost, and integrations are replaced. If you cannot remove access quickly, you are depending on luck that nothing goes wrong during the gap between when access should have ended and when it actually ends. Revocation should be simple, decisive, and well-owned, meaning it is clear who has authority to disable a third-party account or rotate an integration credential when risk is detected. Time-bounded access helps by making many revocations automatic through expiration rather than dependent on memory. The faster you can revoke, the smaller the window an attacker has if something is compromised. Intentional access is not only granted intentionally, it is removed intentionally and promptly. Another way IAM best practices protect external entry points is by keeping administrative power separate from general user pathways, because blending them makes the boundary far more dangerous. Administrative functions, by definition, can change permissions, modify configurations, and affect many users at once. If administrative access is reachable through the same external entry point as standard users, then a compromise has a clearer path to high impact. A safer pattern is to require stronger authentication conditions for administrative roles, enforce tighter contextual checks, and ensure that administrative actions are more heavily logged and reviewed. This is not about distrust of administrators, but about recognizing that administrative identities are prime targets and deserve extra protection. When administrative boundaries are clear, the environment is harder to take over even if a normal user account is compromised. Separating privilege levels keeps the external edge from becoming a single point of catastrophic failure. Governance is the part that keeps all of this from drifting over time, because external entry points tend to multiply as businesses grow and teams build new services. Each entry point should have clear ownership, not as bureaucracy, but as a practical way to ensure someone is responsible for access design, monitoring expectations, and periodic review. Without ownership, permissions expand, old accounts remain active, and temporary exceptions become permanent. Regular access reviews help confirm that external roles still match real business needs, and that unused identities are removed. Governance also supports consistency, so the next team building an external interface does not invent a new access model that conflicts with everything else. When governance is present, IAM becomes a shared discipline rather than a collection of one-off decisions. That consistency is what makes access stay intentional across the entire environment, not just for one well-designed service. By the end of this discussion, the central message should feel clear and practical. because it is about aligning trust with purpose at the most exposed parts of your cloud architecture. External entry points are unavoidable, but accidental access is not, and IAM best practices are how you make that difference real. Strong authentication reduces the chance that stolen credentials open the door. Phishing-resistant methods reduce the chance that users are tricked into handing over access, and least privilege authorization ensures that even valid access is limited to what is truly needed. Conditional access keeps decisions sensitive to context. Token controls keep trust short-lived and scoped, and separation of human and machine identities preserves accountability. Monitoring and fast revocation turn identity from a one-time gate into an ongoing control system that can adapt when the situation changes. When all of these pieces work together, external access stops being a vague risk and becomes a managed, intentional interface that supports business goals without quietly expanding the attack surface.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.